El surgimiento y desarrollo de los medios sociales ha traído consigo nuevos retos que van más allá de la difusión de contenido para las marcas. Algunas empresas han aprovechado estas plataformas para llevar el servicio al cliente a niveles que no era posible imaginar hace algunos años. Otras han optado por convertirlos en un recurso fundamental para la escucha de las inquietudes del consumidor y vehículo clave para construir un diálogo con una audiencia permanentemente conectada. Basta recordar que 9 de cada 10 internautas en México cuentan con presencia en al menos un medio social, lo que habla del potencial que tiene si se identifica que contenidos o experiencias son relevantes para el consumidor. En este sentido, quiero compartirles que IAB México presentó hace pocas semanas un primer white paper dedicado a social media, el cual podrán encontrar en el kit de bienvenida que he recibido en el evento. También lo pueden descargar en nuestro sitio web y es un documento que aporta información para poder hacer esta presentación. ¿Cómo estás? Gracias, bienvenido.
Hola, Gabriel.
Gracias por acompañarnos y por apoyarnos en la gestión para tener a nuestro siguiente conferencista. Si quieres compartirnos qué noticias tiene IAB Social precisamente que contarnos.
Claro que sí, muchas gracias, Gabriel. Bueno, de manera muy breve, platicarles. El día de hoy, IMS es una empresa, la cual yo represento. Trabajamos desde el año 2006 y nos dedicamos a hacer como queremos nosotros posicionarnos. Somos el Silicon Valley para Latinoamérica. Lo que hacemos es que todas las empresas que tienen una visión, que quieren entrar rápido a Latinoamérica, nosotros somos expertos y queremos de alguna manera brindar ese conocimiento a una serie de empresas con las cuales estamos trabajando. Hoy en día, no sé si se alcanza a ver.
En pantalla.
Creo que no pasa. Bueno, realmente estamos actualmente trabajando en publicidad. Acabamos de anunciar hace una semana ahora con LinkedIn, todo lo que es la suite promocionada de LinkedIn la estamos manejando nosotros en toda Latinoamérica. Asimismo lo estamos haciendo con Waze, lo estamos haciendo también con Spotify, fuera de lo que es México, el resto de Latinoamérica, con excepción de México y Brasil. Y por lo que estoy yo aquí es porque yo me encargo de lo que es la comercialización de Twitter a través de toda Latinoamérica. Realmente la asociación que tenemos con Twitter nace hace un par de años. Twitter quería de alguna manera tener presencia en Latinoamérica y de alguna forma pues así fue que nacieron estas dos empresas creando una división que se llama IMS Social. Y por esto el día de hoy tengo el gran agrado de poder traer a una gran speaker, una persona encantadora que trae una gran presentación, Melissa Barnes.
Gracias, Jaime. Pues definitivamente ha sido un encanto poder platicar con ella aquí tras escenario y precisamente ella es responsable de acelerar el éxito de socios más importantes que tiene Twitter en todo el mundo. Su meta es conseguir resultados de negocios visibles con activaciones más robustas a nivel de mercado y a una escala mundial. Anteriormente, Melissa ayudó a compañías como Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, BMW, Tommy Hilfiger, Hyatt y otras a incursionar en la planificación del social business. Tiene una amplia experiencia en el desarrollo de estrategias a largo plazo, contenido, modelos de community management y manejo de crisis en social media. Presentando el tema #Live Storytelling for Brands in Real Time, démosle una cálida bienvenida, por favor, a Melissa Barnes, Head of Global Brands en Twitter.
Muchas gracias.
Hi, everyone. I'm incredibly excited to be here in Mexico. As we've looked at the country over the past year, Mexico has been one of our fastest growing markets for Twitter. And what's amazing is to watch the people in Mexico, fantastic at using Twitter, and especially during the World Cup. There are some great football fans in this country. So it was fun for us at Twitter when we saw the news that there was a challenge against Brazil to see who would win at Twitter, and that actually Mexico won. So for us, actually, we took a photo of that front page of the newspaper, and our CEO sent it around the company. So we're big fans of Mexico up in San Francisco. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of different things today. I'm going to share some big trends that we're seeing from around the world. I oversee our global brands team at Twitter, which means I'm working with our largest marketing partners. And I'm going to try to also help simplify Twitter and how you should think about it as a marketer. And so we're going to talk about moments that matter. And we're going to talk about how people are using Twitter and how those behaviors should inspire all of us when we think about how we want to connect to those people. So first thing is that we see about 1 billion tweets every 2 days on Twitter. So that's a ton of information, and people are talking about all kinds of things we find. They're talking about moments that are related to the world. So when the king of Spain decided to abdicate, he did it via a tweet. When there was a royal baby, that announcement, the first we heard of it, happened on Twitter. And we see TV moments that matter.
It had to be Neymar.
Watch the blue line. This is people talking and on Twitter.
Neymar scores. He has nerves of steel.
People were flatlining as they were waiting to see what happened.
Off the post.
And then they get excited.
Brazil win.
And this is a sort of different kind of data visualization. This is that painful game between Brazil and Germany. And what you'll see is the world respond as different moments happen. And guess what you're seeing? You're seeing a lot of goals being scored. The yellow dots are Brazil and the red dots are Germany. And so that's another sort of way in which we sort of watch these stories unfold. And what's interesting is that as these moments happen on the field, Twitter sort of plays the Greek chorus, right? As we all sort of respond to what we've seen. So when the famous Suarez moment happened, this is the photo that they used, and this is the Washington Post talking about it. But then it started to take on a life of its own on Twitter. And what was interesting about this poster is it's something that was created before the World Cup. And if you look at Suarez's face, it's a little too appropriate. and this poster is something that actually became its own tourist attraction in Rio, so that people could take their photo with it. And it became such a problem that Adidas actually had to take the poster down because it was causing too much of a disturbance in the places where it was set up. And brands certainly had fun with it. This was one of our most engaging tweets that we saw. It came from Snickers. Next time you're hungry, just grab a Snickers. And it continued to the point that we actually saw Suarez use Twitter to share the apology that he wrote. And even more amazing, we saw on Twitter the response back to that apology. So this one moment that played out in all kinds of ways on the platform in this very public venue is part of the fun of it, and we get to watch that happen. And we see cultural moments that matter, right? So if you'll see in the foreground, there are two girls having a great selfie moment, and if you look in the background, you'll see the Queen of England photobombing, which no one thought she knew how to do, but she does. And these cultural moments can kind of take on a life of their own. We've seen world leaders join Twitter in all kinds of countries. And they're on Twitter because they're using it for thought leadership. They're using it to share public policy. When there are elections, we see people join. And so Brazil will be interesting to watch this November as that election takes place. India, the recent election, huge. Twitter was huge for sort of driving and telling that story of the different candidates. And so David Cameron joined Twitter, and it was interesting when we first saw this tweet. The joke is that I too, when I'm about to take an important phone call, the first thing I do is give my phone to someone so that they will take a picture of me so that I can tweet it out so that people know what I'm up to. And this tweet ended up taking on a life of its own.
I got this call from my wife saying, I've just seen this tweet, you must look at this right away. And David Cameron tweeted a photograph of himself holding a telephone to his ear and looking serious. The brilliant Rob Delaney, he'd seen this, and what he tweeted was a photograph of him with a tube of toothpaste in his hand instead of a telephone. So I looked around and there was a tube of wet wipes. So I put this to my ear and put on a very serious face with the same little remarks that Rob Delaney had made. Well, it exploded. It was an hour later before I looked and saw the multitude of photographs that other people had tweeted. I mean, one guy was holding a dog. Somebody else had a baby in their hands, naked little baby. There were bread rolls, there were bananas. It was all very funny. I think there is a hunger for this kind of in the moment excitement. And people today are excited by that, by the immediacy of it. It connects them to events, it connects them to people instantly.
So much fun. And so Twitter is live, right? And we're going to talk about how you can be a good brand that is live without having to think about everything you're going to do in the moment. What we've seen at Twitter is that the best brands who are operating in these live moments are brands who are planning ahead for it. And so we'll talk about how you get there. But let's first talk a little bit about how Twitter is different, how you think about it in comparison to sort of other platforms and other channels where you might share your stories in your messages. So first off, Twitter live, right? When events are happening in the world, they're happening on Twitter. We are public, which means that you can sort of eavesdrop and connect to different people and sort of follow them no matter who they are. When the Pope joined Twitter, Latin America lit up with new users because they wanted to get closer to him. We're conversational, so that back and forth, the apology from Suarez and the response back, you get to watch those exchanges, and sometimes you get to have those exchanges. And we're widely distributed. So stories start on Twitter. Where they go, how they travel, it goes anywhere. So for example, during the Oscars, this famous photo, this famous moment with Ellen, when she took that picture and asked the audience to retweet it, we saw pretty significant engagement, 3.4 million retweets. That's a good number. That's a nice big number. But what we also saw is then the spread of that, right? People talking about it at the Oscars, and ultimately, when you looked at where that tweet traveled, when you looked at how it was covered in the media, the number of newspapers around the world who featured it when they were talking about the Oscars and what happened last night, we got to 4.4 billion impressions. And I'm showing this to you because something that we've also seen at Twitter is that people get that when the World Cup is happening, when the Super Bowl is happening, Twitter is a good place to be. What we're also starting to see is that every day of the week there is an opportunity for you. And understanding how you step back from a billion tweets and find the moment that's most relevant to you and the audience that you're trying to connect with. And that's where we're seeing a lot of innovation happen. And you heard this just in the presentation before mine from Neil. Initiatives in these big moments are great moments to connect to the rest of the world, but there's an opportunity every day, and we need to think about how we do that, because that's how you build a brand over time. So I want to share with you a quadrant that we developed, and this actually came from our experience in working with agencies who were trying to figure out how they were resourcing different activities on Twitter. And so what you see on one end is the always on, right? And on the other end are milestones, those big Super Bowl events. Top half is every day, and then you have campaigns. These are things that are planned, right? We see about 80% of resourcing in terms of people and dollars going into the planned piece. But then you have those big moments, right? You have those big sponsorships, and this is live. So this is unplanned, but you're still putting resources against it. So we see people put time there, and I'd say that again, when we look at where things are trending, we're starting to see people focus more on that everyday quadrant. So I'm going to walk through each of those and start with sort of the daily activity. So again, thinking about data and what you can see when you look at Twitter, because we're public and all that data is sort of, you can step back and analyze in different ways. We realize that there are actual patterns that are predictable. So at Twitter, we know when people are tired. We see this pattern every day of the week. Usually there's a spike right after lunchtime and a second spike later in the evening. We know when people are hungry. We see this pattern every day. And again, you know what those spikes represent, right? And so your first thing as a brand is to understand the patterns of the people who matter to you and the conversations that are relevant to you. And so in Brazil, Hellmann's knows when people are starting to think about what they're going to be making for dinner that night. And they created a campaign where you can tweet at the brand ingredients that you have, and they'll come back to you with a recipe. They're performing a service. They're making somebody's life easier by engaging with them on Twitter. They're incenting them. Different brand, Optus, it shares tips and tricks when people are cooking, and use that pattern in that way. They're helping people. Information is something that people retweet. It's something that people favorite. So if you can inform people and help people in some way, that's a good thing to do from a brand. People want to hear from you when you do that. This is a different kind of pattern to look at. What you're looking at is the UK here, and this is the course of the week, and what you'll see each day is there's a moment in the day where there's an explosion of blue. And what people are talking about is their commute. And if you break it down further, what you'll see is they're talking about commuters and trains and things like that. And some people are talking about commuters who they want to disappear because it's packed sometimes in that metro. And so there's a brand that's interested in this conversation pattern. It's Nokia. And the reason why Nokia is interested in this conversation pattern is think about the commute and people who are taking public transportation. Guess where they're spending most of their time? On their phone, right? They're looking at the news, they're looking at Twitter, they're emailing. And so this is an opportunity for them to step into a relevant conversation. And so they created a series of vines based on this idea of commuters who disappear, especially when things are crowded. Here's another one for you. What's fascinating is that you can tell a story in 6 seconds, right? And this is relevant to where people are in the moment when they're looking at their phone and on Twitter. Smart use of every day. And so think about how you can look at these patterns and sort of what kind of insights you can provide. Often we say, at Twitter, because people come to us all the time, they say, you have so much data, that's incredible, you must be able to do so many things with it. And the reality with data is it is amazing, but your data is only as good as your interpretation of it. And so we see a lot of creativity from marketers when they're looking at which patterns are relevant to them to connect to people in a meaningful way. So when you're thinking about planning, realize that your everyday opportunity is just that. It's a big one, and this is sort of long-term thinking for a brand. Want to talk about live and how that works, right? And this idea of scenario planning. So one of the things that we've sort of invested in trying to understand is how TV and Twitter work. We see 95% of the public conversation about TV happen on Twitter. Again, public platform, you can have conversations or sort of follow people who are following the same things that you're interested in. And what we saw happen at Twitter, and again, this was almost organic, is we would start to see spikes in tweets around certain shows. And this is years ago. And so moments like this would happen.
Yeah! Major the Bafukir composing hallelujah.
He's either terrible or amazing, depending on how you look at these things. And this is the moment that you turn to the person next to you in the living room and say, did you see that? That guy's crazy, right? And the same thing happens on Twitter. In this case, yay, the Nutters have arrived. #XFactor. So we knew that this conversation was happening around these different TV shows, and we started to do research with different brands to see, okay, when you tie TV and Twitter together, how does that affect things? How does that improve things? And we realized that actually the two work really well together. Twitter drives tune-in, and TV drives people to tweet because it's sort of this whole other experience. It's this other layer. And so then we did something interesting. We wanted to understand how this affected people's emotions, right? Did it distract them from the TV? Did it make them more engaged? And so we took two groups. We separated them. One group had their phones. One group didn't have their phones. We put them in a room and we let them watch a game. And we measured their sweat glands. We measured their heart rate. We measured all kinds of cognitive activity. We videotaped them. And what we saw was really interesting. What we saw was that for those people who didn't have their phones, the blue line, they were less engaged. When we looked at the people who had their phones, who were allowed to tweet, much higher levels of engagement, much higher tie in terms of emotional intensity to what was going on. What was also interesting is go back to the videotape, right? We were filming these people. What we also saw was that in the room, people who had their phones and had Twitter were actually talking to other people much more than the people who didn't have their phones and weren't on Twitter. They were sort of, those who didn't have their phones were kind of just watching the TV. They weren't engaging with those around them. So Twitter actually helps you communicate in all kinds of ways, which was very interesting to us. So you think about a brand and why you invest in TV, why you participate in these big sponsorships around these sporting events and around music, around entertainment. What you're trying to do is associate your brand with things that generate positive feelings, right? That positive brand association via connection. So if you can tie to these moments to heighten that experience and make that experience better, there is an opportunity for you. So enrich the experience. Think about how you can make it better for people who are participating, people who are watching. And so go back to sort of sporting events and what we can predict. Again, we don't know who's going to win or lose, but we know that somebody will. In most cases, somebody will score. You know they're going to talk about the players, they'll talk about the coaches. All of these things are predictable scenarios. And so, for example, a brand like Coca-Cola in Japan wanted to figure out how they would enrich different moments during the World Cup, and this is what they did. What you're seeing is a brand doing instant replays of the moment that just happened, only they're doing it with their iconic Coke bottles and during their own kind of take. And what we saw is that this kind of content people found delightful. We saw lots of people retweet this, lots of people favorite this. Japan actually, for us, was a bit of a surprising market during the World Cup. We didn't actually think there were many football fans in Japan. And actually, they broke a number of records while watching the World Cup. So while they might not appear to be huge into football on the outset, actually they're huge fans there. And this was a very successful campaign in the market. Another sort of interesting campaign that we saw happen where we got some really interesting learnings about sort of understanding the way in which emotional intensity can work, right? These scenarios and how you might accelerate or amplify them in some way. And so we worked with Budweiser. Budweiser owns a pretty great franchise, Man of the Match, where they get to announce who is the most valuable player of the match. And so they came to us in planning for the World Cup and said, is there some way that we could use Twitter to help vote or decide who is going to be the man of the match? So we actually created a new product, engineered a new kind of card, which is what this type of tweet design is called, where people could vote on Twitter with one click for who they thought should be the man of the match. So for us, we thought this would be the biggest moment. And sure enough, what we saw is that within a matter of days, millions of people were voting on this, and that felt like a success. But what was even more surprising to us is that this actually wasn't the most engaging part of the campaign. The most engaging part of the campaign was when the winner was announced. Why? Think about that moment with Neymar's goal, when all of a sudden, everyone is celebrating that moment. What we saw happen on Twitter is that once that person was announced and people saw that the person that they were rooting for, the person that they had voted for, had won, their way of celebrating it was to retweet that, to favorite that, because they had been part of that moment. And so Tim Howard, you asked, please give me permission for one US example, which is that Tim Howard, when he had that amazing game and broke a World Cup record for number of saves, for a moment in time, Wikipedia actually had changed the entry for Secretary of Defense for the US to Tim Howard, which for us was kind of amazing. But we saw this tweet get retweeted numbers of times because everyone was sort of behind it and a fan of that. So that's, again, thinking about emotional intensity and what can you offer in that moment that people can celebrate. And in this case, the fact that Budweiser got to create that experience was very valuable for the brand. Interestingly enough, when we measure how Twitter performs against sports sponsorships, when we look at brands that do activations that have a Twitter layer on top of their sports sponsorship, on average, what we see is a 20% increase in brand message association with that sponsorship. It's a frequency play, and if you do it really well, something like Budweiser or Coca-Cola, then actually that number can be much higher. Again, you think about why you do sponsorships. It's to build brand equity and positive association with that brand. So let's talk about campaigns a little bit and how we're seeing brands start to think about campaigns and plan for campaigns differently. Something that's really interesting in my role is I do a lot of work actually with CMOs who are going through an interesting problem-solving moment, right? Marketing in general, not just because of Twitter, but there's sort of a new fluidity that's required. Creative, strategy, and media planning need to work together more closely than they've ever done before. And so what we're seeing brands do is actually CMOs are restructuring their internal teams and they're rethinking how they work with external partners like agencies. And what we're seeing is that people aren't just now becoming sort of specialists, right? They actually have to understand how all these channels work so they can think about how they're going to help a story travel, because that's sort of the nature of the new consumer. They're getting their information from all kinds of places. And the best stories are appearing in all those channels in a way that's consistent, that still serves the channel and how it performs best. So the next thing to sort of think about is that you need to connect your story. You need to think about how it's going to travel and where it's going to go after people have seen it in one place. And so an example of story connection is something we saw out of Brazil with Trident. This is interesting. They actually wanted to put a hashtag on their packaging, and so they changed their packaging for thousands of Trident packages in Brazil, and instead of just doing a hashtag with the product name or the campaign slogan, it was actually a call to action. If you tweeted that hashtag, what would be revealed back to you on Twitter was a snippet of a music video. So this is how it worked. 6 seconds of the video. But then what happened is it evolved. People started to create their own versions of the video that sort of supported it and tweeted it at the brand. And so all of a sudden consumers were generating their own content and giving that back to the brand in a way that was fun. And so it was a way of connecting a story that I think we're starting to see emerge. And we're already starting to see some really interesting things happen in the retail space in terms of how you connect what people are seeing and experiencing in a physical location. Another example of sort of story connection is something that we saw come from Samsung. Samsung is a fun marketer to watch because they really take risks and they're always thinking about how they push themselves. And they're in an interesting position in that, in many ways, they're a challenger brand when you look at how they have to go up against Apple. And so they've done some really big pushes on building that brand equity. And they had a major asset in that they were working with Jay-Z and had arranged to do a partnership around the launch of his Magna Carta album. And so rather than just shoot a commercial or throw a party, what they wanted to do was create their own cultural event. And so they kicked off the campaign with a TV spot during the NBA Final Four in the US, and I'll show you a snippet of it. Oops.
one time and then letting them share it and it goes out.
So people who were following Jay-Z on Twitter actually knew that that commercial would air that night because he gave a leak on Twitter to say, hey, pay attention, there's going to be a special announcement. And then they used their own Twitter handle, the Samsung Twitter handle, to act as sort of the central hub for disseminating information about the campaign, right? Tweet hashtag Magna Carta. For 72 hours, you have exclusive access to this. It's brought to you by Samsung. And you know, with music, especially something like this, when an album like this drops, getting to see it first and having the brand bring that to you, that's a really valuable thing. But they wanted to incent people to talk about it, and they wanted to incent people to follow along. And so if you were following along, you heard before anyone else, because it was shared on Twitter, that Jay-Z was going to just show up and do a Q&A. And so he started taking questions on Twitter, and so you saw questions like this: Mr. Jay-Z, what's your favorite cereal? He tweets back, Captain Crunch growing up, I haven't had cereal in a bit, or in a while, facts only. In this case, sorry, with my slide, different brands saw it, Captain Crunch responded back saying, you know, their own words for it. But what we saw happen is that actually it drove sales. That even though Jay-Z had sort of done a non-traditional way of selling his album by going through the brand, that actually he sold 1 million albums. And Billboard, which is sort of the industry publication in the US that sort of tracks these things and has their own list in terms of who's top of the charts, refused to acknowledge that Jay-Z had sold these 1 million albums because of the way in which it was done. And so he sends out this tweet: if 1 million records get sold and Billboard doesn't report it, did it happen? Ha. New rules. New rules is an important thing to think about as marketers, right? There's new ways of doing things. And ultimately, what they did on Twitter, this push they did at the beginning to build excitement and build momentum, boosted sales overall for the album. It outperformed expectations. But go back to the brand goal. Why was Samsung associating with Jay-Z? Because Jay-Z is one of the best brands there is, and when you think about how you build your brand, to be associated with a brand like Jay-Z is pretty amazing. So when we stepped back and looked at the conversation that surrounded the album, hashtag Magna Carta, what's interesting about this satellite constellation is you see Samsung, you see Jay-Z, and you see Holy Grail. Look at how close they are together and how close Samsung is to the Magna Carta. Again, brand message association, that connection, that positivity. This was a real win for the brand in building the brand. One last example that I want to share with you comes from Coca-Cola Romania. And again, thinking about all the new ways in which we're seeing how brands are connecting consumers and how you can challenge yourself. And so Coca-Cola Romania had an interesting insight and a business goal. Their business goal was that they wanted to increase the brand message association, Coca-Cola, with food. And their insight was that actually there was a decrease in numbers of people in Romania who were actually sitting down and having a meal together. And so they thought there would be something interesting they could do there where Coca-Cola could support people eating meals together and having that sort of positive emotional association happen, right? Support that. But they wanted to give themselves an interesting challenge, which was could they do something live? Could they do something that's connecting across channels? And could they tell this story in a new and innovative way? So this is what they did. last set is the one that matters, right? The business goal. Coca-Cola association with food grew by 50%. When I look at the best case studies, usually they always start with the business goal. Retweets are great, favorites say something, but at the end of the day, you have to report to somebody. And when I look at brands that are doing the best work, they're thinking about what are we trying to get people to do that actually impacts the bottom line. So, find your moments. Think about what makes sense for your brand. We talk about best practices a lot. We know that there are better practices. There are things that haven't been done yet. There is a lot of room for creativity when you look at all the opportunities. And when I look at the audience, the people on Twitter here in Latin America, highly engaged audience, very enthusiastic, extremely positive. There's a lot for brands to do here. So think about this quadrant, think about where you want to be and long-term where you want to resource. And then when you think about the key things and how we see brands be successful, these three things, every day presents an opportunity. Think about how you can enrich your experience, and especially with Twitter, because of the way in which we sort of connect stories and can propel people different channels, think about how you connect that story so it's bigger. A lot of people are already telling great stories. It's always, for us, when we see great content and great creative, that's the first step. But you have to help it travel. And with that, thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you very much. If we have some questions, si tenemos algunas preguntas, por favor, es un buen momento para hacerlos. Live interaction and the urgent need to answer, start, or be part of the conversation with consumers is something that challenges the traditional marketing mindset. What is your perspective about this? Because it's completely different to the traditional marketing concept that we learned in the 90s.
Yeah. We used to think about campaigns and start planning campaigns a year in advance, right? And the creative would be locked and the media would be locked 9 months in advance, and that's how you would move forward. I actually would argue that things haven't changed that much. Again, think about those patterns and those insights when you step back from a lot of data. There's a lot that's very predictable. And so the same planning can be done and the same storytelling can be created. It's just thinking about what moments you want to take advantage of and then how people behave on the platform and how you might enter into some of those potential scenarios.
And I have another question from the audience, and it says, it's similar to previous presentation. In your perspective, what are the most common mistakes that you have seen that, when brands are using social media?
I'd say that from a content perspective, sometimes brands take the people who wrote the banner ads and put them in charge of writing the tweets. And so they're sometimes developing messaging that isn't engaging, that is sort of appears self-serving. That's a big one. I'd say, the point I made about having a business goal is a big one. You can't just show up to Twitter and start saying things and expect that to do something for your business. You have to think about what you want people to do, and what we've seen is that different tweets and different creative actually perform differently. So, for example, there's a large FMCG company or CPG company that was evaluating 2 different kinds of creative, and it was for a soap product. And one tweet creative was much more direct. It said, don't forget to buy this the next time you go to the store. The other piece of creative was much softer. It was about sort of a positive initiative that they had taken on giving back to the community. When they measured how those tweets performed, what they saw was that the tweet that was much more direct, don't forget this the next time you go to the store, actually performed better in terms of immediate ROI, right? People going and buying something. But when they evaluated the tweet that had the softer message about more positive things they were doing, that actually performed much better in terms of building brand equity. So if you have a business goal in mind, you'll design better campaigns and better creative.
And one last question. Twitter has become a fundamental tool for customer service.
Yes.
Do you have an example of a brand or a company that has used Twitter as a tool for customer service?
Yeah. So we see, especially with the airline industry, with telco, those industries, part of their business goal is to show that they're shifting brand sentiment, that they're, that they're improving perception, and that they're resolving issues. So the goal for customer service handles tend to be different. Customer service handles, the goal isn't as how many followers you have. The things that they measure when they're evaluating the success of those campaigns are, have they shifted brand sentiment, or is there more positive sentiment? Mm-hmm. They measure how quickly was the issue resolved, and they measure sort of long-term retainment of customers, right? If somebody starts to follow you on Twitter, you respond back, show that you care about them, brand loyalty increases, that's efficient. And I'd say the last one that they measure is, does it provide efficiencies somewhere else in the organization? So because you have a Twitter handle, does that mean that you need less people to staff and sort of be present to answer the phone, and do that? So we were meeting with a major airline, and they showed us a big room of people on the phone, and we asked them, why are you using Twitter? Why are you investing so much in Twitter? And they said, look at this room. This is defensive marketing. All these people are responding, and it's ending there with that one person. When we're on Twitter and we show that we resolve something and that we care, that's when it becomes offensive marketing. And so I think that sort of mindset is how we see brands approach it successfully.
Wonderful. Muchísimas gracias, Melissa. Thank you very much. Un fuerte aplauso, por favor, para despedirla.